Welcome to Finding Proof, where we discuss all things early stage VC.
We're your hosts, Thanasis and Jenny of the Proof Fund, and our goal is to get to know the best seed and early stage VCs out there.
In this episode, we're speaking with Meagan Metzger, founder and CEO of Dcode, which is an accelerator that connects tech companies with government agencies in order to facilitate the sale of commercial tech products into the government. Meagan, thanks for joining us today, and thank you for being one of the first guests on our podcast. Your group and our group has done some business together over the last couple of years, and I think you have a really interesting strategy for accessing equity in high-performing private companies, and I think our audience would enjoy hearing about that. So in that spirit, can you tell us a little more about what Dcode is?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting, and I'm really excited to follow this podcast as you continue to have more and more guests on it. But yeah, to give you a little bit of background, so Dcode is really focused on the intersection of where private sector, high growth, venture-backed companies meet the government, which sounds a little bit like they might be at odds with each other. But the background of it is really started several years ago when we realized that there was amazing technology that was disrupting entire industries like the financial sector, for example, that the government just was not taking advantage of. And I always like to say that I started Dcode as a concerned taxpayer, where I realized that why are we paying billions of dollars to build this technology from the ground up when the private sector is light years ahead and evolves so much more quickly? So, and then from the tech company side, a lot of times the companies were actually just avoiding this market because it can be super complicated. And once you're over the moat of crocodiles, I like to say, the government can provide such a great source of kind of more like economy proof, if you will, revenue, really sizable contracts, and could be a great growth strategy for companies, kind of the last frontier before you IPO, if you will. So there was a gap there, and that's what we're trying to solve.
And tell us a little bit about the program and how it works. We'd love to know how you make the match between private companies and the government.
Yeah, so typically we have this really fantastic network across thousands of government stakeholders and also the industry that surrounds the government. So think the Lockheed Martins and the Deloittes of the world. So we are able to collect a large set of data around what their problems are they're trying to face or solve rather. And then we also know where the budgets are going because we have some tools that give us insight to that. We know where the needs are. Then we select different themes and topics around problem areas and work very closely across our venture partners and innovators around the country and frankly around the world to identify some of the top technologies that solve those problems. And then what we do is we take in applications and then we will vet the companies, and we're looking at three things, I like to say. So your traditional business viability, your technical viability, but then we throw in a government viability. So we're looking for companies that could be really fantastic in its market, but we feel pretty strongly that we don't want to take companies off track. So we want to make sure that they would come to the government, they would stay, they would survive, and this could become an entire vertical for them and not just what I call an innovation one-hit wonder in the government. So once we do that, then we run them through a program where the idea is take something that a market that usually takes about 18 months to break into, and how do we make that as fast as possible so that companies can get to revenue in under 6 months, which is lightning fast in this industry. And we all know in the government, once you get one logo, it becomes so much easier to get more and more logos. So we will cover everything from what use cases should you focus on, what government agency should you go after, is your pricing model effective here, who should you partner with, how do you hire, kind of all the things that might get someone sideways here. We try to make it as foolproof as possible.
The way you describe it sounds kind of like a typical accelerator, but what I found interesting is that most of the companies that you work with are actually pretty far ahead. They're not like the typical startup. I mean, they might be newbies to the government market, but other than that, they're really like experienced in their own market and their own business, right? Talk a little bit about that. Why is that? And then how do you find the companies to make the match?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And usually I find that it varies a little bit based on the theme and maturity of the tech industry that we're focused on. So for example, if we're talking about advanced analytics, that's a pretty mature market. And so we're able to find technologies that have done work with Tesla and these large corporations, but are just new to this industry and need help. And what's funny is when I started Dcode, I had this theory that we needed to have different tracks. So we had a smaller business track, and then we had one for larger businesses. And it turns out they all just needed the same thing, regardless of their size. It's just the smaller companies maybe didn't have a pricing structure at all. So we're building it straight for the government. And at the end of the day, the government's still incredibly risk adverse, and they don't really want to be customer number one. They want to see that you've done this somewhere else and that it's not a risky bet and that they're not going to go to jail if you screw up. So that, that's why we tend to see a larger kind of different sizes coming through, but it actually works out great because then the smaller companies benefit from being in the same program with the larger companies, and we end up actually having partnerships across our companies, and it's been really interesting to watch.
Silicon Valley has traditionally been skeptical of going after the government market for the obvious reasons that government is very bureaucratic and moves too slowly and all that kind of stuff. How did you deal with that? And did you have some resistance early on when you were getting started? And how do you convince companies that, hey, you should be paying attention to the government as a customer?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, Thanasis, you have no idea. The market has evolved over the last 5 years. It's been really fascinating to watch. So when I started Dcode, my founder story that I like to tell is I sat down with a glass of wine and a copy and paste function, and I pulled the email address of over 500 VCs. And I sent them a cold email and I said, I'm not raising money. This is what we do. We help your portfolio understand how to get to the government market. And I had a 40% response rate, which if you've ever sent a cold email in your life, that's like insane.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And out of that, only 2 of them told me to F off, if you will, and said, I will never send my companies to the government market. The rest of them said, I'm interested because I tell my companies to avoid this market like the plague. It's a mystery surrounded in duct tape, wrapped in saran wrap. I have no idea how to advise a company on that market and how to evaluate a company that has government revenue, in their pitch. I just don't understand it. So, but then I would say, even with that interest, we had a harder time selling the government market than we did Dcode. Like, if you heard our value prop, it made all the sense in the world, and they were still gun shy about whether or not they just wanted to go into this industry at all. Over the last 5 years, that's really started to shift. I mean, in the earlier days, you had folks like NEA and Andreessen that had someone in their corporate development and business development shops focused on government. So they were kind of on the earlier side of that. Since then, you do start to see a shift. And you asked earlier, Thanasis, where we find most of our companies. I would say 75% of them, maybe even 80%, come to us directly from the venture community now. And before, where you saw all that resistance, we actually have inbound saying, hey, I have a company. Can you help me? How can I work with Dcode in my portfolio? So I think some of it is just pure, you can't ignore the market. It's a lot of money. Trillions of dollars are going to technologies every single year.
Why do you think it has changed over the last 5 years? I mean, was it the government moving more aggressively to license? Because historically, the government has developed software kind of in a waterfall approach, and it has taken like gazillions of dollars and years. What changed?
Yeah, well, I think the government has had a pretty big wake-up call. So 5 years ago, if you said the word Silicon Valley, people in the government, kind of went, I'm not sure about that. We were risk adverse. The top 5 incumbent contractors have been the same top 5 for 20 years. Like, that's a problem. But about 5 years ago, the DoD, actually under Ash Carter, went out to Silicon Valley and they stood up their first office just to interface with the tech. And that was kind of the first step. And now you see that happening across a lot of agencies. So now everyone, even the Geological Service, has an office in Silicon Valley. So one, I think they realized we're paying a lot of money to build stuff that doesn't work. And frankly, it's really hard to put a top AI data scientist on a government bill rate. Like, they're all working for Google and getting back massages for free. So how does the government compete? Well, you go and you just buy the technology that these technologists are building. So there's also been a really large shift in contracting. So the government has started implementing really fast ways to buy commercial tech. So before it would take you a year to get through a procurement, and now they have a lot of authorities they can use specifically to buy what they call non-traditional technology. I think a culture shift's happening in the government. These same offices that stood up in Silicon Valley are now reaching out to VCs and saying, hi, I'm here from the government, I have money to spend. And that's hard to ignore if someone shows up at your door and says, I've got money to spend. Still a long way to go, but it's getting better.
What's the deal for the companies? I mean, do they have to pay cash for the program, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, because we're stage agnostic, we have different ways to operate. Traditional accelerators, as you know, have the equity model. We can do that. We like to say that we're founder friendly. So of course, Mapbox came through the program. I wish I had equity in Mapbox. I do not. They just wanted to pay effectively a consulting fee, if you will. So it just depends on the size and what works best for that company. A lot of times we will have rights to future rounds, which I know we've executed together with Proof, because the companies will come through and say, wow, now you know my strategy. I would really love to have you in as a strategic. And then, we can team up with folks like Youth to help fill out these rounds and do something interesting.
Can you give us an example, say, of a company and walk us through how you were able to help them and what they did in the government?
Yeah, the hard part will actually be picking one, which is good. We've had 102 companies come through the accelerator. We have one in flight, and they currently are on contract in over 60 different agencies and programs. And about the last 2 years, they did over 200 million in contracts, which is really fantastic to see and shows you that tide is shifting. One of my favorite examples, one of our earlier companies was Data Robot. When they came through the program, I think they'd raised less than 25 million. They had not hired anyone for the government market yet. And actually, the woman that they hired started and then came through Dcode about 2 weeks later, I believe. And while they were in the program, we did a number of things, kind of all the stuff that I mentioned earlier, but we held what we call our Power Week. And that's where companies can sit one-on-one with dozens of government agencies that would take you years to access otherwise. And we were able to introduce them to DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Department of Homeland Security's Silicon Valley Innovation Program. Fast forward, they've raised over, gosh, I can't remember the latest number now. It's up there in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have really sizable government organization, and they're doing significant revenue there, which is really great just to see them get started.
What does Data Robot do for the government?
So Data Robot has a data science platform where rather than having to hire a ton of data scientists, that usually to develop a data science model could take up to 6 months to develop one, and you still don't know if it's the right model for the data that you have. So think of it as a competition board where Data Robot has thousands and thousands of models inside the platform, and you can upload yours, and then it will run a competition against those models based on your data and help you find the best one for what you're trying to accomplish. It's really fantastic. So it takes something that could take a really long time down to just minutes.
Has the government adopted kind of a more strategic approach to certain technology sectors? I mean, like China, for example, is very strategic and has a centralized plan for pushing the advancement of certain technologies. Has that changed how our government looks at things?
Yeah, it's a hot topic, I would say. AI is definitely one of those areas that the government is focusing in on, both offensive and defensive, I would say, because the challenge that we have is, with countries like China, if they want a technology, they just walk into the company and they take it. We have different morals and ethics, which is exactly what we want to fight for. So basically the government has to woo companies to come and work here instead of just going in and saying, give me your tech. So you'll see an interesting culture shift that has to happen in order to make that a reality. And then also looking at other things that we could do as a country, such as investing in tech. Should the government start their own venture funds, they have a couple, to start making investments. So those are some of the big things going on. We see a lot of investment in AI. the government seems to be rallying pretty hard around private sector space. Obviously, we just had that really great story with SpaceX and getting Americans back up from our own rockets, which is fantastic. And then other than that, it's still a little bit disjointed just because the government still operates very much in silos. So you see groups trying to come together, but there's a lot of cultural barriers to overcome there.
Makes sense. What's one thing that's surprised you since you started working with companies in the government tech space?
I honestly, when I first started Dcode, the first accelerators, I just assumed that I was going to have to teach the companies how to kind of hack the bureaucracy themselves.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And part of that was because of my background and navigating past a lot of that. So I thought it would just be the companies pushing this boulder up a hill, right? And the number of people inside the government that really just want to find this tech and use this tech and are tired of the status quo is pretty shocking. And it's very encouraging. And we actually launched a training program for government to help them hack their own bureaucracy. So now we're educating companies and we're educating the government on how to get to each other. I think the tidal wave of governments that's changing and wanting to find the tech has been the most surprising, the most encouraging.
Right. No, and that's great. That's what you want.
Yes, that's the dream.
What do they want right now specifically? I know you talked about trends a little bit, but what have you been seeing in the past couple months?
Yeah, so there's actually a really big uptick in software factories, they call it. So you mentioned waterfall analysis. I joked that they use agile fall, which is just waterfall really fast. But we see a big uptick in software factories where they're actually doing DevOps and DevSecOps. And so they're looking for those types of solutions to come in. Army Futures Command just announced their first software factory. I think there's dozens across the Air Force. You'll see them popping up around the civilian agencies. So it's really neat to see. And then, of course, cloud and identity and cyber are always hot topics because we continue to get hacked and that threat's only going to go up. And then how do you access, as we start shifting more and more to the cloud, how do you make sure it's secure? And then we can actually do the identity and access controls that they need. So kind of nothing too surprising, but then you have some really bizarre ones that pop up that I love, like vertical takeoff and landing, flying cars.
Yep. They're always fun.
All the sci-fi cool stuff.
When do you think flying cars will actually happen?
Probably sooner than we think they will, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
Like 2025?
I think it will be a policy problem, not a tech problem.
That would be awesome. I'm all for that.
Yeah. I just don't want to drive.
Exactly.
Take me where I want to go.
Meagan, can you tell us a little bit about you and your background and how did you arrive kind of at Dcode as an idea?
Sure. So I've been in this tech government market for quite some time. I started out at a large systems integrator, which I like to say was my first point of inception, where I remember sitting there and we were awarded this $30 million contract. And I was like, why are they paying us to build such terrible software? I mean, it was bad, and I won't name names, and I thought this just isn't how the government should operate. But deep down, I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and I really wasn't meant to work at a large company. I had a really funny story where I met a retired colonel on an airplane, and looking back, he was interviewing me throughout the whole flight, but I didn't quite know it. That probably served me well, or it could have served me horribly, but in this case, it worked out. And I ended up joining him and 4 other folks, and we started a company geared specifically at the government. And we were doing a couple of things. We were doing IT strategy, and we were actually doing acquisition support. So we were helping the government buy technology, which is funny that they have to let contracts to help them buy stuff. So we went from the 5 of us to 80 people in a little over a year. We were on the Washington Technology Fast 50, 5 years in a row. So I like to say a couple things. One, I learned how to build a company geared towards the government market. I had to do everything from get facility clearances to hire everyone, you name it, I had to do it at that time. But my second point of inception was one of our contracts that we held where we were helping them buy technology, and we couldn't get to the stuff that we wanted because procurement was so gnarly. And we're going, okay, we really need that tech, and now I'm going to end up with something half as good. And that's where I'm going, this is a problem, and that's not the way it should work. When I left there, I became the COO for another firm, and we were doing rapid prototyping of tech. And we had this great contract where we could just find the technology and say, here's money. We didn't have to compete it because of the way it was set up. And what I found was we went out to, Silicon Valley and these tech hubs and said, I have money. Do you want to prototype with the government? And companies was like, no, thank you. Like, I don't care that you have money. That after that, the government's too difficult. I have no interest in going there. And then we had the companies that did say yes. And then I watched them just do all the wrong things and trying to break into the government. And it wasn't their fault. There's just nothing that could help them. They were spending $500,000 to figure out if the government even wanted what they had. They were hiring lobbyists and 3-star generals, and none of those things individually are wrong. It's just not the most efficient. That's where I said, okay, now I've built it for the government. I've built a company. I've helped companies do it. I have kind of all 3 sides of this. Let's start something to make it much better so that we can actually get real tech in the door.
Do you have any perspectives on the future of venture, the future of working? I mean, COVID has obviously disrupted a lot of businesses, but in large areas of tech, it's actually being a spark of innovation and then adoption of new technologies. What is your thought about that, and how does that translate into the government?
Yeah, I think my favorite meme, if you've seen it, said, who's responsible for your organization's innovation? Your CTO, your CIO, or COVID-19? And,
I've not seen that.
Yeah, it's really forced so many companies to evolve and I would say kind of light a fire under everyone's rear ends. But so I think I've seen a couple of things. I've seen companies that have thrived, and I've seen them probably have to pivot and adapt faster than they would have normally, which isn't a bad thing, actually. But I've seen an uptick in the companies that said, hey, maybe I should go raise some venture funding because who knows how long this is going to happen. But as you know, then I see a lot of the venture side saying, I'm just going to double down on the companies that I do have in my portfolio. So I think it's still a little early to tell what's going to happen. But since we do investments, we've had a pretty large uptick in the number of companies saying, hey, can you come in as a strategic? The other interesting thing has been how many companies have actually started to look at the government market as a response. And some of it's actually been driven by their venture. So that's something that surprised me, but we actually had a huge uptick in different VCs coming to us and saying, hey, the government actually has all this funds coming out to support companies during COVID or to do COVID response. How can you help my portfolio access that? And then how can you help them recession proof by winning government contracts? And so I think it's actually been the silver lining for the government is the number of companies that have now said, I'm interested in this market where I wasn't interested before. And the VCs starting to understand that there is value in this. And how do you value a company differently if they do have government contracts in this new COVID world that we live in?
What advice do you have for companies that would be looking to break into the government tech space, particularly right now?
So I would say you have to be hyper-focused. The biggest mistake that companies make is saying, I'm going to sell to the government. Like, what agencies are you going to target? All of them. Well, there's over 600 agencies. So you need to be focused. And then I would say just looking at the cost benefit of it, given kind of the financial posture of where your company is right now in COVID. If you can, I mentioned these organizations that have kind of rapid contracting. If you can access those, then it's going to be a great catalyst for you. If you cannot access those, then you still probably need to step back and say, is now the right time to go after the government market or not? And I would say if any company is wondering, just call us. We will be very candid and open and say, no, probably not a good idea, or yes, a good idea. And we do that a lot for our venture partners as well.
Do you accept applications over the transom, or do they have to come introduced to you, or how does that work?
Yeah, I would say we get applications from introductions. We get them cold off the street. We get referrals from companies that have gone through it. So it comes to us a number of ways. The interesting part is we've actually had individuals that came through the program with a company, change companies, and then reapply and come back through. So I guess that's a good sign.
Definitely.
I encourage everyone to reach out, and especially if any tech companies, definitely feel free to reach out if you have questions about the government market. Same with any venture partners that are listening. If you are wondering how to advise your company on when or if they should approach this market, we do that all the time as well. So always happy to give some more insight.
And what does that application process look like? for the companies?
It's a quick form. I would say it probably takes 15 minutes or so to fill it out. And then once we've reviewed it, if it looks like you're a decent fit, then we usually set up kind of an in-person interview. And like I said, our goal is not to get a high volume. We want to get the right companies in. So it doesn't help us to bring in companies that aren't going to do well here. So it's pretty competitive for that reason.
What do you think makes for a really great pitch, specifically for your program?
I would say the companies that do the best, both at Dcode and just in the government generally, are the ones where there's clearly an understanding of the complexity of the market, but also just a passion for it. So there's going to be times where even if you're successful really fast, you will run into some crazy stuff with the government and going, they did what? And if you don't have some sort of conviction about like, I really want to fix some government missions, that makes it a little bit hard. But the board buy-in is critical. And that's where you really need to make sure you've got everyone on your board committed to it, even when it gets a little bit tough, because the second the board doesn't support it, that's when it just goes sideways. And things that we see the most there are going to be board saying, hey, it's been 6 months. Why haven't you closed $10 million of work in the government? I hear the checks are big. Okay. Yeah, that's just not how it works.
Right.
You know, now you can get there, but the first ones are going to be smaller prototypes, most likely.
What is the largest contract that you have been able to facilitate through your program?
Oh, great question. You're going to make me go through the catalog. There's one that we have right now that it was a $30 million IDIQ. So any agency could order off of it, you know, up to $30 million, which was great. A lot of them you'll see are going to be in kind of the couple million. We get a lot of those because the first ones, again, typically are going to be kind of prototypes. But the interesting part with the government is a lot of times a prototype in the government is still bigger than a regular contract in the private sector. So you have to keep that in mind. But yeah, we've had some pretty sizable ones come through.
So we're going to move into our 4 standard question territory, which is my personal favorite. The whole goal is just to get to know you better on a more personal level. We ask the same 4 questions to all of our guests, and we're really excited to hear your answers. So to kick it off, number 1, if you could have a magic wand and change or improve something about the VC industry, what would it be and why?
Well, you're probably going to guess my answer, but we need more diversity in venture, both not just male, female, but I would say diversity across the board. Right. And that's just going to make us stronger, have different viewpoints. And I think the companies that we build will be much better.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, we set a mission. We try to find diversity in founders for the companies that come through. And it's just such a systemic problem that it's really hard because it starts way back earlier when the venture starts making their investments.
I could not agree more. Okay, number 2, and this is one of my personal favorite ones. If you weren't doing what you're doing now and money wasn't a concern, what would you be doing?
Is talent a concern? Because then I'd be a backup dancer for Justin Timberlake.
Yes.
Yeah, I say that this is probably, hopefully on the roadmap for us in the future, but I'd like to do something around sustainable energy and kind of building out some really, I think there's just so much interesting tech out there that could be applied for good.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned. I'll get there.
Okay. We're looking forward to it. And then who's someone that you look up to and why?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that whenever I get asked this question, it's like I want to pull pieces from different folks because, for example, like the vision and the tenacity of Elon Musk is really interesting. Just what he is willing to try and think that is possible. But then there's also this other side of him that I'm like, okay, we could leave that part to the side. Let me take that piece. You know, I really have some of the personal ones that are going to sound a little cheesier, like my gymnastics coach from college. So I did NCAA Division I gymnastics, and she was pretty instrumental in kind of just my viewpoint on life, because she was very much like, you can always do more than you think you can, and you can do anything for more than 30 seconds. So she just provided such a resilience and taught me that, you know, I don't think you can go into building companies if you don't have that resilience, you know, within you.
100%. And so on that note, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
Well, I'm going to quote my dad here. So my dad was an entrepreneur. He had his own business for many, many years. And when I was looking to start Dcode, he said, betting on yourself is the best bet you can make. You can't lose if you're doing that. So that one really kind of stuck with me because it's nerve-wracking to quit a nice paying job and say, hey, family, I'm going to go do something and it's going to be a gamble and who knows, but if it fails, at least I know it was me and it wasn't anybody else. My mom, I would say, is on the other side of it. I think if my mom was in charge, I'd be an actual government employee instead. So
okay.
She thinks I'm crazy, but it provided a great balance, right?
Exactly. Best of both worlds.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Meagan, thank you very much for doing this with us. We really enjoyed learning more about Dcode, and we did learn some new things today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and look forward to continuing to work together in the future.
And follow us on Twitter @ProofVC or on our website at proof.vc.